Hi, everyone, and welcome to our lecture on Atlantic history. So, today we're going to talk about exploration and what that looked like across various countries and what even is Atlantic history, right? I mean, you might not have ever heard of that before. It's actually kind of a new pursuit. And so, hopefully, that will all be clarified by the time you get to the end of this lecture. I'm going to minimize myself and we will get going. So, what is Atlantic history? Well, it can be defined as a study that encompasses interactions among the people of Europe, Africa, and the Americas from about the 15th century onward. Once explorers discovered that a new world and other lands existed, they set out to explore and conquer them. Atlantic history is the study of exploration and the conquest of territory around the Atlantic Ocean by the Europeans. The movement began with the Portuguese, but all the major European nations followed their lead. So I think one of the quiz questions asked which nation led exploration, and it was Portugal, right? Spain next. And we also talked about how the Vikings, remember Eric the Red and Leif the Lucky, they found Canada even before the age of exploration, but this is when it really kicked off and became popular. So, the field of Atlantic history is a fairly new pursuit. The early ocean explorations of the Greeks and Romans might be considered as an early aspect of the discipline. Overall, Atlantic history can be divided into three categories. The first one is called circum-Atlantic history, and so this is like zones of exchange, circulation, and transmission. The second category, transatlantic history, is deeper and more meaningful. It compares and contrasts nations, states, and societies and the economies that lie on the Atlantic rim. And the final one is called cisatlantic, and it's a method that was born in the 18th century through the words of Thomas Jefferson. It examines one place in relation to the whole. So even though Portugal started the movement by the late 1800s, they actually owned very little of Africa. The French and British had overtaken the majority of the continent at that point, and sadly, only a very minute part of Africa remained unowned by a European nation at that time. So I have a map that we do. I'll probably have my in-seat students take a look at it, and some of my classes, not particularly this one, have a grade for it. But it basically you kind of like color in which nations had colonized what parts of Africa, and it's just a very such like I said, such a small part that was left unowned by the end of this. So Thomas Benjamin, whose book I highlighted in the reading and study materials, he argues in chapter 3 that trade in slaves in Angola became the most powerful and lasting European impact in Africa. So I think if this is true, it begs the question of where the economy of African nations might be today if colonizers had worked to build up native societies rather than to focus on their own nations. Their nations were already overdeveloped anyway, so, there's a lot of different ways that exploration could have gone, and we're looking at how it actually played out and why that matters on the global stage today. Now, I will say not every impact of colonization was bad. I see lots of good aspects too, and I hope that you guys see that as well. I think there's a lot of things in the mainstream right now that really want to point the finger and just say, oh, this is a terrible part of our history, and it just shows the greed and selfishness and things like that. And perhaps it does. But what about the good stuff? And you're not a fair historian if you don't look at all sides. And so primary source documents reveal the horrors of cannibalism. There were some pretty serious things going on in some of these countries, especially, and they were all tied into the religion. They had to sacrifice to the gods and things like that. And so, Christianity came in and sort of eradicated some of those practices like cannibalism. And even the natives, if you read the primary sources in Games and Rothman's book, they recognized that the Europeans were more developed in society than they they were. They felt very inferior to the Europeans when they came in because they knew that their way of life was very primitive, whereas the Europeans were a little bit more sophisticated. Had, I mean, just things like just war theory, things that you just don't do because it's just wrong. The Europeans had sort of an understanding of that a lot of the tribes didn't have. And you can see that coming out in the primary sources that they recognize that. Benjamin argues pretty much for the negative aspects of colonization, but I think there were a lot of positive aspects as well, and it's just important to have a well-rounded view of all of it. The world today is currently at an important crossroads regarding cultures and races, and this makes the study of Atlantic history very modern and relevant. In order to fully understand modern times, mankind must understand the past that led them there. Benjamin points out that there are multiple ways to view history, especially in terms of economics. He explains the difference between radical neo Marxist views that teach the concentration of capitalism while simultaneously detailing the views of Max Weber. Weber encourages an understanding of societies that are devoted to knowledge, invention, and innovation. And so, economics is deeply tied into the study of Atlantic history for a number of reasons. For one thing, obviously the slave trade was that was economically driven. But then you have other factors as well. Something as simple as tea, which I think I talk about. It's on my next slide. No, it's not, but I'll get to that. But the tea, sugar, tea had to be popular so that they could sell the sugar. And so there's an article that talks about that as well. So anyway, so just kind of know that economics is deeply tied into the studies of Atlantic history. And I'll flesh that out as we go along. Atlantic history covers several themes, including the importance of Western Europeans, the growth of Atlantic trade, colonization, and economics. So once exploration of the Atlantic began, the nations became interconnected like never before. Three main continents, America, Africa, and Europe, are the general focus of Atlantic history. When many people think of Atlantic exploration, you may think of explorers. Can you name any? Columbus is one that we all know. Can you name some others? Like Vasco da Gama, even Henry Hudson, who the Hudson River is named for. There were so many. So these people initiated the movement with their brave exploits and discoveries. However, it might be advantageous to begin with the people groups who were waiting to be found rather than the ones who sought them out. So, in other words, we do tend to start with the European side of things. What if we looked at all of this from the perspective of the Native Americans, of the Aztecs, and all of these tribes, and kind of try to picture what that looked like to them, seeing all these people coming in. And so Native American groups were intelligent and inventive people who were often inclined towards morbid violence. Africans carried some similarities to Native Americans, although they also included diverse cultural traditions. Africans resided in the Canary Islands, Northwest Africa, with the Islamic peoples of the South Sahara, the pastored area between the Sahara and the Sahel, Western Sudan, and the Niger Valley. So you have sort of this conglomerate of people in Africa. Remember how we talked about all of these empires and how they spread across the top of Africa? So you do have Islam in the top. There's also a lot of voodoo in Africa and things like that. You look at, here in Georgia, we have the Gullah Geechee down in the south. And, if you've ever toured, I toured Kingsley Plantation a few years ago. I say a few, it's been like 7, 8, might have been a decade ago. But it's a very interesting plantation. They were in Spanish territory, but it talks about the voodoo among the slaves there and things like that. And slave, they didn't really uprise on the Kingsley plantation because he was pretty kind to them. He would let them save up money, buy their freedom. But Spanish territory, slavery in Spanish territory was brutal compared to the slavery in English territory because the Spanish didn't provide food, clothing, and shelter. They expected the slaves to work and then make their own clothes, grow their own food. Basically they had to provide for themselves. And so the slave population in the Spanish regions decreased by about 3% a year because it was easier for them to purchase more slaves than it was to take care of the ones that they already had, which is very sad. And so, but in America, in the British colonies, slavery actually wasn't all that popular. There was a time when slavery was outlawed under James Oglethorpe here in Georgia. And when Oglethorpe was no longer governor and a new person came in, he implemented some laws like the headright system, and that sort of encouraged slavery. And I would say it wasn't until really like the early 1800s that slavery began becoming really popular. And then, you talk about development of cultural identity, right? The South developed the identity that it had, and that, 1810, it got stronger, 1820, 1830. By the time you get up to 1860, the eve of the Civil War, it had fully developed at that point. And so you kind of have to go back and look at how all that came about and why, which I'm not going to go into for world history, but American history will cover some of that. So you also have Asian exploration, which we talked about. What about the Chinese turn inward, right? They didn't really get involved, but Chinese exploration did occur. As you guys saw, they were involved with the Jesuits who tried to evangelize and things like that. So they weren't completely isolated, but very much so. Um, Now that brings us to wind currents. So the wind currents in the Atlantic and sailing technologies of the period provide further insight into how Atlantic exploration developed. Some Christian historians believe that the hand of God moved explorers across the ocean through the winds of change to carry them in whatever direction he desired for them. And perhaps that's true, and I don't know, that's, up to interpretation. But we do have these currents here. And so, you have one, the Canary Current in the south that will take you around and kind of bring you into the Florida region here. And then you have the Gulf Stream it will bring you back into the north. And it's kind of interesting how these currents just kind of naturally do that. And so the ships had figured out how to get into those currents to push them where they wanted to be. Um, Dr. Douglas Mann from Liberty University offers unique ideas about the importance of making connections between the nations surrounding the Atlantic Ocean in order to better the understanding of the Atlantic world. So he calls them a hemispheric community. And so, in other words, there was this unique development because of interactions and interdependence on all. It's almost like an early form of globalization, if you will, a hemispheric community. And you can see in my photo here, I've got all these people that make up all of these continents working together in a way that they never have before. And in a sense, I suppose that's true. But what really makes a community? So, in his publication, Bowling Alone, Robert Putnam argues that people in communities feel like they are well suited to the group, and this makes them want to engage in certain activities such as civic involvement or recreational opportunities. People who feel at home in their communities will build up social capital through various types of community involvement. Now, what is social capital? Well, that is the power of a community, according to Putnam. He says that social capital is made up of bonding that creates strong group loyalty, which comes from individual clout, companionship, and both formal and informal bonds. Okay, so according to that, could we call all of these places around the rim there in the Americas, in Africa, Europe, is that really a hemispheric community? Well, analyzing the geographical regions of the Atlantic world in these terms begs several questions. So, first of all, did all people living together in these shared lands feel that they belonged there? And second, how interested were they in community involvement? And finally, if their social capital could be analyzed through statistical data in the way that Putnam outlines in his publication, how would they measure up? Well, the obvious answer to the first question is that all people who were involved in Atlantic exploration did not believe they belonged to one large community. Interestingly, many European colonists named their settlements after familiar hometowns. Like, York was a place in England, so they call it New York. Hampshire, the same, so it's New Hampshire. And then we got New Spain. You can go on and on. New Orleans. So this simple truth reveals something deep in their hearts. They wanted their new home to reflect the community that they came from. They had ties. Maybe the places where they came from were not perfect, right? But they had ties that were strong enough that would cause them to rename a new place like the old place. So they did want some elements to remain the same. Now, many of the native peoples who were discovered by Europeans would probably have argued the opposite claim, that their community was broken apart because of discovery. However, in much the same way that a house might be demolished prior to the construction of a new one, many of these nations were deconstructed and rebuilt according to a new architectural design. It is possible that natives in some areas may have felt a sense of belonging and community with the Europeans. I think that's possible. I think we see that in some primary sources. In the beginning, the tribes were interested in building relationship with the Europeans and working together. Some tribes, not all, right? Slavery and warfare changed that in many ways. And even if the groups had attempted to work together, it's doubtful that the venture would have succeeded because of the vast cultural differences that divided them. So it's really difficult to put statistical data together like Putnam does in his Bowling Alone book. He examines statistics related to like voter turnout. We obviously don't have that. We can tell how involved they were with the community. They didn't, they weren't democratic, so they didn't vote, but they kind of abided by, the religious and social political structure. Philanthropy. So in other words, when you love your community, you give to it. Leisure activities, union memberships. These are sort of apples to oranges in a way. If the natives and Europeans had worked together, could they have built a thriving community of people who live side by side? Could they have united under one government? And what would leisure time look like if they all played games together? These are kind of interesting questions of how exploration could have went and probably did in some regions. The movie that you're going to watch, The Mission, shows a beautiful picture of the Jesuit missions and how they helped the Guarani people. And unfortunately, I really need you guys to go in and look at the history, because there are some facts that are not historically accurate in that film, and it's your job to find them. However, there are some things that are very accurate. And the the lines were redrawn, right? The political boundary lines, and it impacted the missions. And so, if, how do you have separation of church and state in the midst of the age of exploration so that it doesn't bother the work of people like that? Was the work actually, what was it helpful? Was it, how do they portray it versus how it actually was? I think it was a beautiful depiction, although maybe it's still some friction there. Could have been a very beautiful thing had it have lasted. So, but watch the movie and then do your review, and your review is your opportunity to tell me what you think about it. So, let's move on. So, based on the answers to the questions, I personally would say that there wasn't really a group loyalty among most of the natives to the Europeans. I think there was a lot of friction, maybe some hard feelings because of the slavery and because the natives felt like their land was being encroached upon. And eventually the issue was forced. They became one community, but not because everyone felt a strong group loyalty. It had taken centuries to forge bonds of love and respect to bring diverse communities of the Atlantic world together. And the beauty of what we have in the world today is that we are more united. I think we do feel that community loyalty now, years and years later, centuries later. But it took a long time to get to where we are today. And so I did say that Portugal was a leader in exploration. So after Portugal, it was Spain, and Spain was in its golden age from about 1580 to 1680. During this time, the Spanish Empire was modeled like the Roman Empire in many ways. It could be said that Portugal paved the way for exploration, and Spain brought the Spanish language overseas. Mexico and Peru eventually became the double foundation of Spain's American empire. The Mission movie is based on this region. However, the health of these people began to fade after the Spanish arrived because of diseases, harsh working conditions, and things like that. I already talked about Spanish slavery, so I'm going to skip that. So unlike the Spanish, the Portuguese organized important trade centers in Africa. Some of their most important trading ports were set up on the Guinea coast. The Portuguese revolutionized agriculture in West Africa with their introduction of new fruits and crops from the Indian Ocean and the Americas. So you can kind of see on this map what that looked like. Um, and you also have class society, and this is essential to understand. So, Portuguese traders took African wives, and a class system was created based on that. The upper class or royalty was born in Spain. The middle class, known as the Creoles, were Spanish people who were born in South America. And the Indians, mestizos, and this is a mix of European and Indian ancestry, and the mulattoes, that was European and African ancestry, made up the lower classes of society. The Portuguese planted 14 captaincies for the purpose of developing the colonies in the Americas. Unfortunately, many of them were disorganized and only a few survived. Brazil became a conglomerate of captaincies rather than a unified nation, and the Portuguese attempted to rectify the situation in 1620 by dividing the country into two states. You have the basically the state of Maranhão, and the state of Brazil. Estado is state. So a population chart reveals the rise in numbers of people of mixed race between 1549 and 1819, which further divided the nation into factions. Most historians would argue that the Spanish paved the way for other nations to benefit from the discoveries while doing less work and investing less of their own money. The rise of trade in the new colonies created circumstances for unwise decisions of Spanish leaders that led to colonial decline. The Habsburg dynasty, who you may have heard of, accrued an enormous amount of debt, and that led to seizures of incoming gold and silver and loans on government bonds. And France became the wealthiest nation in Europe with the largest population. Supply and demand was a major factor in the success or failure of colonial plantations, and a number of products were selected for cultivation. Sugar, as I was saying earlier, was one of the most important, and it was grown mainly in the Caribbean islands. Caribbean. So here's the article: Private Tooth Decay. So the slave sugar triangle is the subtitle of this. So the sugar industry was profitable due to slave labor. In order to broaden the consumer base, Europeans wanted tea to be available to all citizens. And so, if they all had access to tea and coffee, they wanted sugar to go with it. I don't know about you, but I like sugar in both my tea and coffee. I am a true girl from the South. And I went up north and I was disheartened. They just brought me a raspberry tea, and I just like my Southern sweet tea. But the article makes the claim that even though common people were starving in many European countries, while the rich dined on delicacies, sugar and tea were readily available to everyone. And so, according to the article, it was so important that the lack of having sugar would cause uprisings. And so, one primary source document states that the natives were surprised that the French people were starving, but they refused to revolt and burn down government houses for the sake of food, but they did so for the sake of having sugar for the tea. And so, there's something to be said about that. I do think we love the things that we love, right? And especially in America, we love our entertainment and things like that. It's very interesting how people will behave sometimes. I find that one of the most intriguing aspects of historical studies. So, all those as Spain and Portugal began the exploration movement, the Dutch and English dominated most of the Atlantic during the 18th century. Before 1713 and 17, or I'm sorry, between 1713 and 1739, Europe enjoyed its longest period of peace, which was mostly because the bank accounts of France and Britain had been exhausted in earlier conquest. However, by 1739, the British had built up their navy to approximately 124 ships. France, on the other hand, neglected their navy due to a number of factors. They had a poor credit history. They weren't really paying back their loans. They had high interest rates on new loans because of that. And so, where France was once sort of a leader in exploration, they really declined. By the time of the French Revolution, they were very economically challenged at that point, to say it nicely. Capitalism began to evolve during this time, and I think this is also important to say. Merchant capitalism transformed into industrial capitalism. And so we're going to spend, after we do this 2-week unit on exploration, we're also going to do a 2-week unit on the Industrial Revolution, and we'll really get into the shift in capitalism when we get into those particular units. So the ties of interconnectedness between European nations grew exponentially during the 18th century. However, each nation saw the need to protect its boundary lines, and this led to the creation of colonies like Georgia. So Georgia was created to secure the border, ironically. We have, if you know anything about colonial history, we have Spain. Spain was the colony right below us. Like I said, I went to the Kingsley Plantation. It's just across the Georgia line in Florida. And so that was a Spanish territory. We gained Spain from the Adams-Onis Treaty, if you want a fun little fact there. But so Spain, we wanted to make sure that we could extend, and I say we, I'm talking about the British, wanted to extend their colonies all the way down south as far as they could to stop the Spanish from moving up any further. And so we created what became known as Fort Frederica. It's on St. Simon's Island, and it was built in the 1730s. If you've never been, it's kind of a neat place to visit. Everything is made out of this cement called tabby, and they're crushed up shells. I don't know if you can see it, like all these little white dots are actually shells. And they've got sort of an outline of the town where you can go through and tour. It's just kind of a neat place. But the French forts, the French also built forts to maintain their boundary lines. This is a map of the French and Indian War here. You can see these areas with the red lines were disputed. We're not really sure who owned what. You have French territory in the blue, British in the red, and then disputed areas here. And so the French started building all these forts to create boundary lines to say this is our land. And so eventually the French lost most of their land. As we know, the Louisiana Purchase afforded us the interior of America. And the French, they were really struggling for money. However, I will say that, fun fact, Napoleon wanted to rule the world, right? He was power hungry and wanted to be dominant. And he was anticipating that, Spain actually owned this interior for a time. Napoleon bought it from Spain, thinking that he would conquer America too. And then eventually he sold it to Jefferson in 1803 for pennies on the dollar. It's quite a bargain. So fun little fact there about Louisiana territory. So the American Revolution grew directly out of the consequences of the 7 Years' War. This was due to large amounts of debt that led to excessive taxation. And the war ushered in the age of democracy, which is the push for equality and liberty that came out of the Enlightenment. And of course, many of the royals thought that democracy would never amount to much. They thought it was sort of silly. But the American Revolution proved this idea to be incorrect. And in many ways, it fueled the events of the French Revolution as well. You also had revolutionary figures in South America. So Simon Bolivar is a prominent figure. He's related to exploration. Bolivar, who has been called the George Washington of Brazil, considered what the future for his country might be like and hoped for a, quote, grandiose America. So he contemplated the ideas of Montesquieu. Now, Montesquieu is known for his separation of powers. He's the one who came up with that idea in a book called Spirit of Laws. And so he hoped that the road to freedom and democracy for the nation and in South America would be a successful pursuit despite the difficult process in obtaining liberty. Bolivar aided the creation of one of the most democratic systems in the age of the revolution. So this was because the Spanish nation allowed for representation in the national legislature. However, the idea of representation was realized long before 1812. The American colonists fought England due to taxation without representation. Now, I think it's fair to say they had representation, but their representatives were not doing a great job in representing them. But the English government argued that the colonists had, quote, virtual representation through lords and crown and parliament. And so, there are all kinds of ideas. I teach a class on the foundations of American government, and that representation is one of the most important issues, one of the most contentious issues that was discussed at the Constitutional Convention. And Hannah Pitkin has a really great book on theories of representation. If you're interested in understanding that more, maybe take a look at her work. Hannah Pitkin, Theories of Representation. She literally, quote, wrote the book on that particular topic. Border struggles resulted in hardships for everyone. You have Samuel Winthrop, who was a resident of Antigua. He endured the destruction of his farm due to wars between the French and English around 1666. Winthrop authored a detailed account of the event to encourage the government to find peace, and he hoped that political leaders would consider the extent to which their disputes impacted the common man. Other sources reveal opposing viewpoints from governmental officials and pastors. That brings us to pirates. That's always a fun topic. The number of pirates active in the Atlantic in the 18th century was astounding. Around 2,000 souls pillaged and plundered numerous villages. Many pirates were once naval officers, and so that enabled them to be successful on their own. Interestingly, pirates adhered to the notions of justice, and they actually had codes of conduct, believe it or not. There were some pretty famous pirates. Blackbeard is one. His real name was Edward Teach. He's originally from Jamaica. And so the English had previously seized Jamaica in 1655, and the island became a hub for privateering. Pirates were known as buccaneers. And this is where it gets really interesting. Port Royal was established by the first governors as the capital city, but it became a home for pirates. And so you had all kinds of interesting, nefarious activity with prostitutes, runaway servants. Jews went there for refuge. It got very overcrowded. At one point, there were like 3,000 people, and it's a small place. And it grew to be the third largest town in English America. So in 1670, the Treaty of Madrid attempted to suppress piracy, and the Jamaica Act of 1683 did the same, but they weren't super successful. The pirates just kind of kept on. And so in June of 1692, Port Royal, which you see on the map here, became known as the Sodom of the English. And amazingly, it was swallowed up by an earthquake. Sort of reminds me of Pompeii a little bit. If you've ever studied ancient Rome and Pompeii, the new capital city was rebuilt in Kingston, and footage of the sunken city can be viewed in a documentary, and I say below. So here, National Geographic does a very nice job of explaining. They use primary source accounts. There were a few people who lived through the earthquake, but many of them died. And there's one account from a man who says the sky turned a very ominous color, like it was almost red or something. He talks about the earth just shaking and everyone's thrown into the sea. I mean, it was, so you can watch the documentary and kind of pull from that if you want to hear more about Port Royal. Historically, in 1936, you had a company who made Jolly Roger pirate cards. Collectors today pay thousands of dollars to attain original copies of these cards. They're pretty rare. The Jolly Roger was a traditional name for identifying flag of most pirate ships. It boasted a black background with the skull and crossbones. I'm sure you guys have seen it. So interestingly, very few pirate flags still exist today. Most of them have been destroyed. As far as I know, there's only two on exhibit museums in America. One of them is down in Key West. It's at the Pirate Museum. And so here's a picture of it. It's actually not black, it's kind of red. But this is the one at the Key West Museum. If you're interested, if you ever go down there, you can take a look at it. So that covers a basic content of what we're going to be talking about over these next couple of weeks. Now let's talk about the review. Okay, so kind of shift gears here. Next week, you guys have a review due, and a review is not a paper. So, kind of, you're going to write it a little bit like a paper because it needs to be formatted in APA. It's got to have a title page, and you've got to have references, right? So, references should back up. Show me the sources where you found the real history for this particular topic. Okay, so as you go through, you're going to have to identify what is real history in this film and what is not, and show me the sources where you found your information. So, a scholarly review analyzes an article, book, or film or performance. And so, we're doing a film. You will do a book review later on. And so, kind of lock that into your mind. You might want to go ahead and purchase the book if you want to look ahead. One of them is available for free in the Georgia Highlands Library. And the other one, if you want to do it, I think you'll have to buy it. I don't know where to find that one. But look ahead at the book review and kind of be planning that also as you write your movie review. So reviews are important because they explain how work fits into the discipline. So history, how is this work important to history? That's our discipline. And it explains the value or contribution of the work to the field. So how does this enhance our understanding of history? Okay, reviews offer an opportunity to respond to another person's ideas and interpretations. Remember, you're watching a film, which is one interpretation of this event, right? And so you look up the real history and figure out, have they spun the history at all to make you see it in a certain way? Are they trying to push a political agenda? Is there a religious agenda? Like what is it with this? So make sure you review, not summarize. To begin your review, look up the author or director of the book or film that you are reviewing. That is the very first, most important thing that you should do. The author is going to tell you a lot. You need to know what their area of specialization is, what are their degrees, what's their angle. So, the author or director of the film, who are they? Why does it matter? So when you start your introductory paragraph, you need to say something like, the mission, which was directed by so and so, or you could say the mission was directed by so and so who was blah 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 or is, kind of give a little blurb about why we should care, who this person is, and what they did, what their contributions were to this film. And then, yeah, make sure you explain to the reader why they should care. What degree and experience do they have that makes them an expert on this particular topic? Offer a brief summary of the work. Now, this is important. Your summary should only be like one paragraph. A review analyzes, it doesn't summarize. And so make sure that you go through, in the course procedures, there is a summary versus analysis tip sheet. I encourage you to go in there and read it. I'll show you when I get through with this PowerPoint, I'll pop in there and show you right quick. But your summary should only be one paragraph. Assume that the person reading your paper has already seen the film. And so you don't need to go into great detail about what was in the film. You need to analyze the film. Um, Conduct historical research on your topic. This is essential. And again, this is going to take you a little while, which is why you have 2 weeks to get this done, right? So I'm kind of pointing it out now. You do the slave trade database this week. You work on this review throughout this week. If you, get it close to being finished, get your draft done. And if you'll submit it to me this week, I'll take a look at it. Next week, I will not be looking at any reviews. Okay. So if you send it to me next week, I'm going to say, I'm sorry, I only do that during week 3. Okay. Because it's due on week 4. That's a little perk for getting it done early. Conduct your research, find out if the work was historically accurate, explain to the reader which parts can be confirmed and any areas where the author or screenwriter took liberties. Explain why you think the author may have changed the story for dramatic effect, interpretation, or whatever. Make sure your review has a strong thesis in your introductory paragraph. So in your first paragraph, you're going to talk about, this is the film, this is the person who directed the film, and you're going to take a debatable stance on that topic. Okay, so it shouldn't be factual information. It should be your opinion, but without referencing yourself. right? So make sure you don't say I think or I believe or anything like that. It needs to be worded this film was well done because blah, 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 or this film was not well done because. You can also argue that it was historically accurate. This film was historically accurate because blah, 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 or it was not historically accurate. Or you could say it's a little bit of both. Sometimes it is easier to draft your thesis after you've conducted the research on the topic and you've written a large portion of the body of the paper. So, don't feel bad if you feel, at the beginning when you first sit down to write, you might feel kind of aimless, and that's okay. Do your research and come back, and then you'll have something to say once you know more about the topic. The conclusion should restate the thesis in a new way and summarize the main points that you use to support it. So again, don't offer new information in the conclusion. That's a common mistake.